It was late November 2011 in the small town of Hallowford, the kind of place where the seasons seemed to move slower and the rhythms of life revolved around its few constants, the town square, the Sunday market, and the high school perched just beyond the railroad tracks. Warren Klein had been one of those constants. For more than a decade, he'd been the quiet, steady presence that drifted in the background of countless school days and after-hours events. Students knew him as the man who pushed the squeaky-wheeled mop cart down the halls, who offered a small nod if you passed him after class. Teachers knew him as reliable, the one who never called in sick, never asked for extra hours, and never shared much about his personal life. He lived alone in a modest apartment a few blocks from the school, paid his rent on time, and never made trouble. On the night of November 28th, the last Monday of the month, Warren had the late shift. It was one of those bitterly cold nights when the wind cut through your jacket and the streets emptied long before midnight. By 11:30 p.m., the building was mostly dark, save for a few security lights and the dim glow from the vending machines in the faculty lounge. The school's last remaining staff had already left hours earlier. Warren was alone, mopping the floor near the back maintenance hallway. The cameras caught him wheeling the mop bucket into the boiler room area, then later pushing it out, pausing briefly to adjust his gloves before heading toward the rear maintenance exit. At exactly 11:42 p.m., the grainy black and white footage showed him locking the back door. He turned, glanced once down the shadowed hallway behind him, and walked out into the frigid night air. That was the last confirmed sighting of him. He didn't clock out, which was unusual, but not impossible. Sometimes staff forgot and were reminded the next day. This time, there was no next day. When Warren failed to show up for his shift the following afternoon, the head custodian called his cell phone. No answer. By evening, calls to his apartment went unanswered as well. It wasn't until one of his coworkers stopped by his place and found the lights off, the mailbox full, and his car still parked behind the school that alarm truly set in. Police were called, and a missing person report was filed that night. The initial sweep of the school was methodical. Officers moved room by room, checking classrooms, storage closets, and locked offices. In the boiler room, they found something odd: Warren's keys and his school-issued radio sitting in the mop bucket he'd last been seen pushing. It looked almost staged, the keys neatly coiled on their lanyard, the radio lying on top. The discovery made little sense. A janitor without his keys couldn't move freely through the building, and Warren was known for keeping them clipped to his belt at all times. Outside, the frost-covered parking lot showed no signs of disturbance, no fresh footprints leading toward the woods or the road. The only vehicle left was his, an aging sedan with a thin layer of ice on the windshield. Inside, the glove box still held his registration and insurance papers. His wallet and phone were not there, though investigators couldn't confirm whether he'd left with them or not. An even stranger detail emerged when police reviewed the alarm system logs. The back maintenance door Warren used was set to arm automatically when closed, but the records showed the system had been disarmed less than 20 minutes after he left the building. There was no corresponding footage of anyone re-entering through that door, and no other entry points were tripped. Whoever had disarmed it either knew how to bypass the system or had legitimate access to do so. When word reached Warren's family, they were adamant that he hadn't left by choice. He had no history of depression, no debts, no pending legal trouble. His younger sister told police that Warren had made plans to help her move the following weekend, and that he'd seemed in good spirits when they last spoke. The theory of a voluntary disappearance didn't fit, but in the absence of evidence, it couldn't be dismissed outright. By the third day, the police presence at the school was heavy, the media beginning to take interest. Parents watched from behind police tape as officers carried out bags of potential evidence, but the quiet consensus among the investigators was troubling. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious crime scene, and no clear trail to follow. The last confirmed moment anyone could place Warren was in that blurry frame of surveillance footage, a man stepping into the cold, carrying nothing, walking toward a vanishing point only he could see. The questions began to multiply, and with them, a sense that whatever happened that night might not have begun outside the school at all. The search for Warren Klein began before the sun rose the next morning. By dawn, patrol cars ringed the school's perimeter, their headlights casting pale cones across the frost-coated grass. The air was sharp with the bite of late November, the kind that stung your lungs with each breath, and the only sounds were boots crunching over frozen ground and the low murmur of officers conferring over maps. Detectives quickly realized that the search couldn't be confined to the building itself. If Warren had left on foot or been taken, he could be anywhere within miles. A coordinated grid search was launched, pulling in not just local police but county deputies and volunteers from the community. The surrounding area was a patchwork of possibilities, a small cluster of wooded trails behind the football field, the freight train tracks that cut past the school's southern boundary, and a scattering of industrial lots where the sodium lights glowed through the fog. Every sector was combed. Searchers used long-handled hooks to drag through underbrush, probing for any sign of clothing or disturbed ground. By mid-morning, cadaver dogs were brought in. The handlers moved methodically through the school's interior, starting with the boiler room where Warren's keys and radio had been found. The dogs' nails clicked against the concrete as they sniffed along baseboards and darkened corners. In the basement storage area, a dim, low-ceiling space filled with old desks and boxes of outdated textbooks, one dog stiffened, gave a low whine, and sat down hard. A second dog later displayed the same reaction in the same spot. The handlers marked the area, but when investigators searched it thoroughly, peeling back tarps and shifting heavy furniture, they found nothing but dust and debris. The alerts were logged but inconclusive. As the day wore on, search teams widened their sweep. The woods behind the school were thin but tangled, littered with deadfall and patches of dense brush where visibility dropped to almost nothing. The train yard, though active, was dangerous to navigate, with rusted-out cars sitting motionless on side tracks and the constant clanging of metal from somewhere out of sight. Several volunteers insisted they'd heard something, a faint metallic thud, a dragging noise, but when officers investigated, there was nothing. Then, during a secondary sweep of the building's perimeter, a patrol officer noticed something odd. A side service door on the east wing, tucked away near the loading dock, stood slightly ajar. The door was supposed to be locked at all times unless deliveries were coming in, and no deliveries had been scheduled that week. More troubling was the fact that it didn't appear in the alarm log at all. It wasn't tripped, meaning either the door had been propped open before the system was armed, or someone had bypassed the alarm entirely. Inside, just beyond the threshold, lay a thin trail of grit and damp leaves leading into a maintenance hallway. Forensic techs photographed it and took samples, but the debris could have come from anywhere. The hallway itself ended in a locked cage where cleaning equipment was stored, and nothing there appeared disturbed. Still, the unlocked door gnawed at investigators. Was it an escape route Warren had taken, a point of entry for someone else, or was it something entirely unrelated, a maintenance oversight lost in the shuffle of a chaotic night? The lack of concrete answers only added to the tension building in town. In a community where the school was a central hub, parents began to question how a man could vanish from inside its walls without anyone noticing. Some demanded tighter security. Others whispered that maybe the school administration knew more than they were saying. At a hastily arranged press briefing, the lead detective assured reporters that all possibilities remain on the table. But behind closed doors, the frustration was palpable. Every promising lead, the dog's alerts, the propped open door, the scattered rumors, seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. By the end of the first 48 hours, search teams were exhausted, their boots caked with mud and frost. The woods had been scoured, the train yard walked end to end, and the industrial lots canvassed with no sign of Warren. The school's dark, echoing halls felt no closer to giving up their secrets. And as night fell again over Hallowford, the unanswered question lingered heavy in the air. If Warren didn't make it past those doors on his own, then who made sure he didn't? By the time winter break approached, the official search for Warren Klein had slowed. But inside the school, his absence was impossible to ignore. His name wasn't mentioned in morning announcements anymore, yet the hallways carried a constant undercurrent of quiet speculation. It began with vague observations from students and teachers. Warren had seemed off in the days before he vanished. Normally attentive to his work, he'd been slower, distracted, pausing mid-task as if his thoughts had drifted far from whatever was in front of him. One sophomore swore she'd seen him late one evening outside the science wing, standing motionless in front of a locked door. He didn't seem to hear her footsteps as she passed, his gaze fixed on the door's handle before he finally turned away. To her, it had looked less like absent-mindedness and more like hesitation. Among staff, the whispers were sharper. A few quietly confided to one another that Warren had been going out of his way to avoid a specific faculty member. He'd change his walking route through the halls, take the long way to the supply closet, even delay restocking certain classrooms until he knew that person was elsewhere. No one claimed to know the reason, but it was clear the avoidance had started suddenly, within days of his disappearance. Then came the rumor that refused to fade. Warren had been tasked with cleaning an area of the building that was normally kept locked. For students, the possibilities became fodder for gossip. The sealed-off north wing with its dusty old lockers, a storage room in the basement where retired equipment was dumped, or even the attic-like crawl space above the auditorium that had been padlocked for years. No one could agree on which location it was, but the story's core detail remained intact in every retelling. Warren had been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Detectives, still desperate for leads, tried to track this down. They met with the custodial team, asking if any special assignments had been issued that week. Official schedules showed nothing unusual. Hallways, classrooms, restrooms, gymnasium, no restricted areas, no deviations. When pressed, the school administration flatly denied authorizing any such task. The principal dismissed the rumor as misinformation that threatened to distract from the investigation's real priorities. But the denial had the opposite effect. Staff who had stayed silent began to mention small, unsettling details. A teaching assistant recalled seeing Warren with a set of keys far larger than the small ring he typically kept clipped to his belt. The keys had been heavy, the sort used for master locks or storage areas rarely opened. A senior on the basketball team claimed that 2 nights before Warren vanished, he'd passed by the closed-off north wing and seen a maintenance cart parked just outside its locked double doors. He hadn't seen Warren himself, but light had been seeping out from beneath the door, illuminating the hallway floor. Other fragments emerged. A part-time librarian thought she'd heard movement above the auditorium one afternoon, well after classes ended, but when she looked, the hatch to the crawl space was locked. A substitute custodian remembered hearing the faint smell of bleach in an otherwise dusty corner of the storage basement, but chalked it up to routine cleaning. None of these details on their own proved anything, but together they painted a picture that was harder to ignore. For those who believed the rumor, the theory was straightforward. Warren had been asked, perhaps unofficially, to clean or inspect a restricted space. While there, he had encountered something or someone that set in motion the events of that final night. Maybe he'd seen evidence of theft, vandalism, or something more sinister. Maybe he had been confronted, warned, and silenced. Others argued that these were nothing more than attempts to impose a narrative on an inexplicable absence, the human need to fill in gaps with whatever scraps of information were available. The administration's firm denial only deepened the divide between those convinced Warren's disappearance began inside the school and those who believed it was unrelated. Parents began to call for more transparency. At school board meetings, questions were raised about access logs, key distribution, and why certain areas of the building had remained sealed for so long. Officials maintained that no one was hiding anything, but their unwillingness to discuss specifics did little to quell the growing suspicion. Detectives, meanwhile, found themselves in a frustrating position. The rumor about the locked room was compelling, but without documented proof, a work order, a witness willing to go on record, or a physical clue, it remained circumstantial. They revisited the alarm system records, cross-referenced key logs, and quietly re-interviewed staff who had been on the premises in the days before Warren vanished. No one admitted to assigning him to a restricted area. No one claimed to have seen him inside one. Still, the whispers persisted, and not just from students. Veteran teachers who had worked in the building for decades noted that Warren's was not the first disappearance connected, however loosely, to the school. Years earlier, a night security guard had quit abruptly after a disagreement with administrators, and though nothing was ever made public, it was rumored he had also been seen in parts of the building closed to most staff. By January, The theory that Warren had entered a locked section before his disappearance had become the unofficial undercurrent of the investigation. For police, it was one more thread in a case already knotted with inconsistencies. The disarmed alarm, the abandoned keys, the side door left ajar. For those inside the school, it was a reminder that some doors were closed for a reason, and that Warren, for reasons still unknown, may have walked through one of them just days before he was gone. 6 months after Warren Klein vanished, the case had settled into that uneasy stage where police still called it open, but rarely made public statements. Leads had thinned to almost nothing, and the few that did surface often collapsed under scrutiny. Then, during a routine follow-up round of interviews, detectives spoke to a substitute custodian who had filled in at the school only a handful of times. What he remembered from the night Warren disappeared was brief but unsettling. He told them that he'd been called in for a short maintenance shift the following morning, not to clean classrooms or hallways, but to restock supplies in the main storage and check the boiler room. He remembered the weather being bitterly cold and the building unusually silent, but what stayed with him most was a faint chemical smell lingering in the corridor leading to the boiler room. It was bleach, he was certain, not the mild, diluted scent you'd expect from everyday mopping, but a sharper, fresher concentration that made his nose sting slightly. It was out of place. By then, Warren had already been reported missing, and the school was buzzing with quiet unease. The substitute hadn't thought much of it at the time, not until detectives asked him to recall anything unusual. The odor had been strongest near the boiler room door, which was propped slightly open. Inside, the dim light revealed nothing obviously disturbed. The old metal tank sat, humming, gauges steady, pipes warm to the touch. But he remembered that part of the concrete floor looked cleaner than the rest, as if it had been scrubbed recently. No watermarks, no dust, just a faint dampness that seemed odd given the rest of the floor's film of grime. When detectives pressed him for more, he admitted that he'd assumed the smell came from some after-hours cleaning, maybe by Warren before he left. But something about the timing nagged at him. The scent was too strong to have lingered for hours without being renewed. Investigators took his statement seriously enough to revisit the boiler room themselves. By now, months had passed, and any chance of recovering chemical residue or trace evidence was long gone. The room looked as it always did, cluttered with spare filters, coils of hose, and metal shelving stacked with maintenance tools. Still, the substitute custodian's memory was enough to open a new line of questioning. Police went to the administration and requested all cleaning and maintenance records for the night Warren vanished. According to the official logs, no deep cleaning was scheduled. In fact, the night's assignments had been ordinary, standard floor care, and trash removal. No one was listed as having worked in the boiler room area, and no chemical-intensive jobs had been approved. When detectives asked the principal and head custodian about the bleach smell, they were met with casual dismissal. It was probably just part of a routine scrub down, they said, maybe even spillover from a mop bucket. Schools used bleach all the time, and nothing about that night stood out to them. But when pressed to provide a work order or signed log entry for any boiler room cleaning, none existed. What puzzled investigators further was the discovery that the boiler room's logbook, a thick binder where every maintenance task was supposed to be recorded, was missing its page for the date Warren vanished. The absence wasn't immediately obvious. The binder had been returned neatly to its shelf. But flipping through the entries, the sequence skipped abruptly from November 27th to November 29th. The missing sheet hadn't been torn jaggedly. It appeared to have been removed cleanly, as though someone had unclipped the binding rings and lifted it out. The head custodian claimed he had no idea why the page was missing, suggesting it might have been removed accidentally during an audit. Yet there was no record of such an audit, nor any explanation as to why the only missing entry was from the very night Warren disappeared. Detectives tried to match the bleach odor to any legitimate work done in that area in the days that followed, but again, nothing lined up. The chemical smell, the suspiciously clean patch of floor, and the missing log page seemed to point to an event that someone either hadn't wanted recorded or had deliberately erased from official records. Though they couldn't prove the boiler room was a crime scene, the details added to a growing list of oddities. The disarmed alarm, the propped open door, the rumors of Warren entering restricted areas, and now a possible attempt to wipe away physical traces. For the first time in months, investigators felt they were brushing against something more concrete than speculation. Still, without physical evidence, the boiler room remained a place of suspicion rather than proof. It was a space hidden in plain sight, part of the school's daily machinery, yet curiously resistant to scrutiny. And for those following the case closely, the idea began to take root that whatever happened to Warren may have started or ended in that cramped, dimly lit room beneath the school's floors. By the start of 2013, more than a year after Warren Klein vanished, the investigation had lost nearly all momentum. What began as a full-scale search with daily updates to the public had dwindled into occasional check-ins, half-hearted tips, and a case file that seemed to grow heavier but no closer to resolution. Detectives still referred to it as active, but behind closed doors, they admitted there was little left to work with: no body, no clear suspect, no conclusive crime scene. The physical search had long since ended. The woods, train yards, and industrial lots had been combed over repeatedly, each time yielding nothing but frustration. Surveillance footage had been reviewed frame by frame, yet no image after 11:42 p.m. on November 28, 2011, placed Warren anywhere. The small handful of leads, the bleach smell in the boiler room, the unlogged side door, the missing logbook page, all remained tantalizing fragments without proof to link them. Attention shifted to Warren's personal life in hopes that something there might reveal a hidden reason for his disappearance. His apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit a few blocks from the school, had been left almost exactly as it was the last day he was seen. Neighbors described him as private but friendly in passing. His rent was paid up through the month. The refrigerator held half a gallon of milk and a carton of eggs that had long since expired. There were no signs of a rushed departure, no suitcase missing, no packed bags, no gaps in his belongings. His work clothes hung neatly in his closet, his small collection of paperback novels sat dusted on a shelf, and his toolbox rested in its usual spot by the door. Warren's wallet and keys were never recovered, but investigators noted that his bank account and credit cards remained untouched from the day he vanished. There were no large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions, and no activity on his phone records. It was during the formal clearing of his apartment that officers found the one item that gave them pause: a small cardboard box tucked deep in the back of his bedroom closet. Inside were a dozen newspaper clippings, all carefully folded and stacked, their edges yellowing with age. The articles told the story of another disappearance, that of a school janitor named Robert Hensley, who had worked in a neighboring county's high school in the early 1980s. The similarities were hard to ignore. Like Warren, Hensley had been described as quiet, dependable, and unassuming. He vanished during a late-night shift, leaving his keys behind. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no body were ever found. In that case, rumors had also circulated about him working in a restricted part of the school shortly before he disappeared. That investigation had gone cold within a year, and to this day, it remained unsolved. The discovery raised uncomfortable questions. Why had Warren kept these clippings? Was it a personal interest in local mysteries, or had he seen some connection between Hensley's disappearance and his own circumstances? The dates on the articles suggested he had obtained them years earlier, but no one could say when or why. Family members had never heard him speak about Robert Hensley or the case. Detectives noted the eerie parallels in their reports, but for reasons that remain unclear, the connection was never pursued in depth at the time. Perhaps it was because Hensley's case was decades old, or because the two men worked in different towns and school districts. There was no obvious link between them beyond occupation and the unsettling resemblance in how they'd vanished. Without a direct line connecting the cases, it was filed under interesting, but not actionable. For Warren's family, the lack of answers was a slow torture. His sister called the police station every few weeks, only to hear that there was nothing new to share. The unanswered questions began to feel permanent, each day widening the gap between the man they had known and the man who now existed only in the context of a mystery. In the community, interest faded. The posters on telephone poles had long since peeled away. The local news had moved on, and for most residents, Warren became another name in a list of tragedies that happened somewhere else. But for those who had known him, the unease lingered. The fact that a man could vanish from inside a school, a place built to be safe and familiar, without leaving a single definitive trace, gnawed at anyone who thought too long about it. By spring of 2013, the case file sat in the cold case storage room, its spine marked with a number that would rarely be called. All that remained were unanswered questions, a trail of strange coincidences, and a small box of clippings about a disappearance from 30 years earlier that no one could explain, and which now seemed to echo louder than anyone wanted to admit. By early 2023, the case of Warren Klein had been dormant for years, gathering dust in the cold case archives. The school where he'd last been seen had long since returned to its routine, though among older staff his disappearance remained an unspoken shadow. That spring, severe roof damage from winter storms forced the district to authorize extensive repairs to the upper floors, including the gymnasium and its adjoining storage areas. Contractors arrived in waves, tearing up water-damaged ceilings, replacing beams, and clearing out long-neglected corners of the building. It was during one of these jobs that two workers tasked with stripping the ceiling above the gym's storage loft noticed something unusual. The layout behind the old insulation didn't match the blueprints they'd been given. Where there should have been solid joists and drywall, there was instead a narrow opening leading into a low, dusty crawl space. The gap was barely high enough for someone to crouch in, and it had no visible hatch or door connecting it to the rest of the building. Curiosity overcame protocol, and the workers pulled back more insulation to get inside. What they found was unsettling. Against the far wall sat an old industrial mop bucket, the yellow plastic faded and streaked with grime. Nearby were two empty bleach bottles, their labels curled from age, caps missing. A cracked, opaque plastic storage bin lay on its side, the lid leaning against the wall as if it had been removed and never replaced. The air was dense with a sharp chemical tang, bleach, unmistakable and strangely fresh for a space that, according to blueprints, wasn't supposed to exist. Even more disturbing, the floor beneath the bin and bottles looked cleaner than the rest of the dusty boards, as though it had been scrubbed down years earlier, but had somehow held its color against time's wear. The contractors immediately reported their discovery to the project foreman, who called the school administration. Within hours, the site was locked down and police were notified. Detectives, along with a forensic team, arrived to examine the crawl space. They photographed everything, bagged the bottles, and dusted the bin's lid for prints. To their surprise, a partial fingerprint lifted cleanly from the underside. The print was run through databases and the match came back within days. It belonged to Warren Klein. The revelation hit investigators like a jolt. For over a decade, there had been no confirmed trace of Warren beyond the surveillance footage of him leaving the school that night in 2011. Now, they had physical proof, placing him in a part of the building no one had admitted to accessing, a space not even recorded on official architectural plans. Detectives began piecing together possibilities. The attic crawl space sat directly above the gym's back hallway, which connected to the maintenance corridors near the boiler room, the same area where Warren's keys and radio had been found. If he had gone up there willingly, why? And if he hadn't, who had put him there, and for what purpose? The mop bucket and bleach bottles suggested cleaning, but of what? The cracked bin, large enough to hold bulky items, raised darker questions. The location itself posed problems. The only plausible way into the crawl space would have been through a disguised panel behind the gym's equipment room shelving, now partly hidden by years of storage overflow. It wasn't somewhere anyone would stumble into by accident, and it wasn't a place you could access quickly without knowing exactly where to look. The school administration reacted with carefully measured statements. They expressed shock at the discovery, claimed no knowledge of the space's existence, and promised full cooperation. Privately, several older staff members told investigators they had always suspected there were hidden pockets in the building from earlier renovations, but none could recall anyone being assigned to clean them. For Warren's family, the news was both devastating and vindicating. After more than a decade of feeling that his disappearance had ties to the school, they now had tangible proof he had been somewhere inside, after the time he was supposedly last seen outside. The fact that his fingerprint was on the inside of the bin lid was difficult to explain away. It meant he had handled it, though no one could say when or under what circumstances. The crawl space was sealed as a crime scene, and every item inside was catalogued. Forensics tested the boards, insulation, and any scrap of material that might hold DNA. The bleach smell, though faint by the time of the investigation, was still strong enough to catch in the back of the throat, a reminder that whatever had happened there had been deliberately cleaned. For detectives, this was no longer just an unsolved disappearance. The attic crawl space above the gym had transformed the case into something far more ominous. Someone had taken deliberate steps to hide it, to leave it off the records, and to keep it sealed for over a decade. And Warren's presence there, now a confirmed fact, was a piece of the puzzle that demanded answers. Whether those answers would ever surface was another question entirely. The discovery of the attic crawl space above the gymnasium and the fingerprint inside the cracked bin lid was enough to jolt Warren Klein's disappearance out of cold case storage and back onto the desks of active investigators. For the first time in over a decade, there was a tangible link between Warren and a concealed, restricted part of the school. Detectives began re-interviewing anyone who had worked alongside him in those final weeks of 2011, hoping that distance from the event might loosen memories that had been withheld or overlooked. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. Several former co-workers, some now retired, recalled that Warren had seemed increasingly tense in the days before he vanished. Normally calm and methodical, he had been jumpy, glancing over his shoulder in empty hallways and cutting conversations short when certain staff members walked by. A substitute custodian remembered Warren telling him that someone had been messing with him after hours, moving tools, unlocking doors he had just secured, and leaving cleaning supplies in odd places. He'd shrugged it off at the time, but in hindsight, the substitute said, Warren's tone had carried an edge of unease. As these accounts were compiled, investigators also dug deeper into archived maintenance logs. It was during this review that they uncovered a single-page request dated just 4 days before Warren disappeared. The form, signed by an assistant facilities manager, assigned him to clear debris and inspect an attic storage space above the gym. No other attic cleanings were scheduled that year, and the description was vague. No mention of which access point to use or what exactly he was expected to find. The request had been filed in hard copy but was absent from the digital records submitted to police during the original investigation. When asked about it now, school administrators claimed they had no knowledge of the assignment and suggested it may have been misfiled. The implications were hard to ignore. If Warren had been in that attic space, the same hidden area now found to contain his fingerprint on the inside of a bin, it meant he had either followed that work order or been lured there under false pretenses. The attic's omission from official blueprints and its apparent disuse for years only deepened the mystery. Detectives began to wonder whether the work request was legitimate or fabricated as a way to get Warren alone in a place no one else would think to look. Police also revisited the timeline from the night he vanished. They considered whether Warren might have gone into the attic after locking the back maintenance door at 11:42 p.m., perhaps at someone else's request. If that happened, it could explain why the school's alarm system was disarmed 20 minutes later without any logged entry. Someone with knowledge of the system may have bypassed it to move in and out undetected. In light of these findings, investigators started to build a list of individuals who had the authority, keys, and knowledge to access both the gym's equipment storage and the maintenance corridors leading to the attic crawl space. Former administrators, custodial staff, and even a few teachers were contacted. Some were cooperative, others guarded, and a few refused to speak altogether. The reopening of the case also stirred emotions in the community. For Warren's family, the attic evidence and maintenance order were the strongest signs yet that he had not simply walked away from his life. For some of his old colleagues, the revelation brought guilt. Memories of small incidents they'd had dismissed as harmless now seemed more sinister. One retired night guard admitted to hearing movement above the gym late at night that week, but assuming it was just heating pipes or wildlife. Detectives knew they were still missing key pieces. They didn't yet know who had issued the attic work order, why it wasn't in the original case files, or what had really happened once Warren entered that hidden space. But they now had a path forward, one that tied together Warren's sudden anxiety, the unexplained after-hours disturbances, and his confirmed presence in a concealed area of the school. The question was no longer whether Warren had been in that attic. It was who sent him there, and why he never came back. While investigators combed through storage rooms and filing cabinets in search of any overlooked records related to Warren's case, they focused on areas rarely accessed since his disappearance. In a disused office tucked behind the maintenance wing, a cramped space with peeling paint and filing cabinets coated in a decade's worth of dust, they found a heavy steel cabinet that was locked. The key had been taped inside a nearby drawer, as if forgotten. Inside, among stacks of outdated payroll forms and brittle work orders, was a large leather-bound ledger. Its pages were yellowed and stiff, the kind of record-keeping long since replaced by digital systems. The front cover bore no title, just the initials MS pressed faintly into the leather. Flipping through it, detectives saw that each page was organized by year, listing custodial staff members' names, dates of employment, and occasional handwritten notes in the margins. But what caught their attention almost immediately were the crossed-out names. Heavy black lines struck through certain entries, obliterating them so thoroughly that some names could only be made out by tilting the page toward the light. Warren's name appeared on one of the final pages, marked with a thick slash across it. What made this discovery more troubling was that several of the other crossed-out names corresponded to employees whose departures had been abrupt and unexplained. One had resigned without notice in the mid-1990s, another had relocated suddenly in 2001, and at least two others, according to archived news clippings, had simply vanished, their cases quietly mentioned in local papers before fading from public attention. There were no accompanying explanations in the ledger for why any name had been struck through. Some entries bore vague notations like closed, no return, or inactive, but others were blank. To the detectives flipping through the book, it felt less like a formal employment record and more like a private log kept for reasons no one had ever intended to share. When investigators brought the ledger to the attention of the current administration, the reaction was uniform confusion. The principal claimed never to have seen such a book and suggested it might have been an informal list maintained by a former facilities director. No one could say why it had been locked away or why it contained such cryptic markings. It was only when detectives began contacting retired employees that fragments of context emerged. Several former staff members remembered hearing about a special list in the maintenance office, a kind of unofficial roster said to track personnel issues that didn't make it into official HR files. They recalled whispers of hush resignations, where staff were quietly encouraged to leave after incidents the administration didn't want made public. In most cases, the details of those incidents were never shared beyond a small inner circle. One retired night shift supervisor claimed that, during his time, the list was spoken of almost like a warning. "If your name ever got crossed out in that book," he said, "you didn't come back. Didn't matter if you quit or were fired, you were just gone." He admitted he didn't know what determined those decisions, but he remembered one janitor in the late 80s who had vanished after being assigned to clean an old, unused section of the building. His name, he believed, had been crossed out before word of his disappearance even reached most of the staff. Detectives noted that the ledger seemed to span at least 3 decades. Warren's name, on the final page, was one of the last entries in the book. The handwriting style in earlier entries differed from the later ones, suggesting the ledger had been maintained by more than one person over the years. The ink crossing out Warren's name was fresher than some of the older entries, though still faded enough to confirm it had been marked soon after his disappearance. The problem, as with so many pieces of this case, was proof. The ledger was suggestive, even disturbing, but without knowing who had created it, maintained it, or authorized the markings, it was difficult to connect it definitively to Warren's fate. Officially, it was just an old book with names and notes, nothing that could stand as evidence in court. Unofficially, to the detectives working the case, it was another thread in a growing tapestry of patterns, one in which Warren's disappearance fit almost too neatly. In the absence of concrete answers, the ledger was logged into evidence and locked away. But for those who had seen it, the image of Warren's name slashed through in thick black ink lingered in their minds. It was as if, long before the search for him had gone cold, someone had already decided he wasn't coming back. In the months following the attic discovery, new leads began to emerge from people who had remained silent during the original investigation. One of the most striking came from a retired history teacher who had worked at the school for over 3 decades. She contacted detectives after reading about the reopened case in the local paper, saying there was something she'd seen in the days before Warren vanished that had never left her. She recalled leaving the building late one evening in November 2011, just a few nights before Warren disappeared. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit only by the harsh glow of overhead lamps. From across the lot, she saw Warren standing near the trunk of his car, speaking with the vice principal, Richard Halden. What caught her attention was the tone. Even from a distance, their voices carried, not loud enough to hear words clearly, but sharp enough to convey tension. She saw Warren shake his head, step back, and glance toward the building before walking away quickly. Halden remained by the car for several minutes, arms folded, watching Warren leave. At the time, she thought little of it. Staff disagreements happened, and Halden had a reputation for being strict, especially about maintenance procedures. But with the attic evidence now public, the memory took on a more unsettling shape. She admitted she hadn't reported it back then because she assumed it was a work-related issue and didn't want to get involved. When detectives dug into Halden's employment records, they found something notable. In the school's key access logs from 2011, his name appeared on a sign-out form for a set of master keys that included one for the attic storage above the gym, the same hidden space where Warren's fingerprint had been found years later. According to the record, Halden had signed those keys out in mid-November, roughly 2 weeks before Warren disappeared. There was no corresponding entry showing they had been returned. The absence of a return record was unusual, as the school's policy required keys to be logged back in within 48 hours. It suggested either poor record-keeping or that Halden had retained the keys for an extended period without oversight. When current administrators were asked about the missing keys, they said they had no knowledge of their whereabouts and assumed they'd been lost during Halden's tenure. Halden himself could no longer answer questions. He had passed away in 2017 after a brief illness. His personnel file painted the picture of a man who kept a tight grip on certain areas of the school. Several former staff described him as territorial about maintenance spaces, often inserting himself into custodial matters that weren't part of his job. One custodian remembered Halden insisting on inspecting storage rooms personally before approving work orders, even for minor cleaning tasks. Another recalled being reprimanded for entering the attic without written authorization, though no such rule existed in the employee handbook. The combination of these testimonies and the key log entry drew a troubling outline. If Halden still had access to the attic in the days before Warren's disappearance, and if Warren had been assigned to work there just before vanishing, then the overlap was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Detectives considered whether the argument in the parking lot might have been about that very assignment, Warren resisting or questioning why he was being sent into a space most staff didn't even know existed. Still, there was no direct evidence linking Halden to any wrongdoing. His death meant no opportunity for questioning, no chance to clarify the key log, and no way to confront him with the attic discovery. Without a witness to the argument who could hear the words exchanged, it remained an anecdote rather than proof. What lingered most for investigators was the pattern. The attic had no official function, yet certain individuals seemed to have both access and interest in it. The access wasn't always recorded, and in Warren's case, his confirmed presence there now stood in stark contrast to the official narrative that he had left the building before vanishing. Halden's missing keys, the unexplained confrontation, and his history of controlling certain spaces all added weight to the growing suspicion that the attic was more than just an unused crawl space. For Warren's family, the revelation brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it provided a possible human link to the hidden attic, someone who may have known why Warren was there. On the other, it underscored the frustration of arriving at such a lead only to have it dissolve into silence because the man at the center of it was gone. In the official record, Halden's name became another in a long list of unanswered questions, but to those closest to the case, his shadow seemed to stretch backward into 2011 and settle over that dimly lit parking lot, where an argument in the cold night air might have been the last sign of a truth that died with him. In the weeks following the forensic sweep of the attic crawl space, the school administration moved quickly to seal it off once more. The access panel was reinforced, the equipment room shelving replaced to block the entrance, and the district maintenance supervisor signed off on a formal closure order. For investigators, the attic was now a processed scene, logged, photographed, and emptied of its contents, and for the staff, it was a place best left alone. At first, it seemed as though the matter had been laid to rest. The renovation work continued without incident, the gym reopened, and the faculty began to focus on finishing the semester. But about 3 weeks after the attic was locked, the first report came in. A night custodian, working the upper floor near the gym's storage hallway, noticed a sharp chemical scent in the air. He recognized it instantly. Bleach, strong enough to sting his nose and cling in his throat. At first, he thought it might be from his own cleaning supplies, but his cart contained only standard mild disinfectant. The smell was coming from somewhere else. He followed it down the corridor toward the equipment room. The closer he got to the panel leading to the sealed attic, the stronger the odor became. When he reached the door, it was almost overpowering. His first instinct was to check for a break-in, but the panel was secured exactly as it had been after the police finished their work. No damage to the locks, no sign anyone had forced their way in. The custodian hesitated, then decided not to open it. He made a note in the nightly log and told the head custodian in the morning. By the end of that week, 2 more staff members, both teachers staying late to grade papers, separately reported catching the same scent while walking past the gym hallway. One described it as fresh, the way bleach smells in the minutes after a spill, not something that had been lingering for weeks. Another said it came in sudden waves, fading almost completely and then returning, stronger than before. Neither of them saw anyone else in the area at the time. Maintenance staff were sent to investigate, but each time they arrived during the day, the odor was gone. The attic remained locked, the seals unbroken. There were no containers or spill marks in the hallway, and the ventilation system showed no irregularities. The bleach bottles recovered during the original search had been removed by police, and no new ones were found anywhere nearby. The reports kept coming for several days, each one eerily similar. The smell strongest at night, concentrated near the sealed attic entrance, vanishing by morning. The administration, wary of reigniting public interest in Warren's case, did not make these incidents public. Officially, they treated it as a maintenance curiosity, possibly tied to residual fumes trapped in insulation or ductwork. But those who noticed it firsthand felt differently. Among the night shift crew, the talk grew uneasy. Some began to alter their cleaning routes to avoid the gym hallway after dark. Others admitted they felt watched when walking that stretch alone, the bleach smell curling through the air like a reminder of something that had been carefully hidden. One custodian told a coworker it was like the room upstairs was working on something again. When police were discreetly informed, they returned for a brief inspection. They found nothing new, no footprints, no shifted dust, no fingerprints that hadn't already been cataloged. The attic appeared exactly as it had the day it was sealed. Whatever caused the odor left no trace behind. With no physical evidence, the matter couldn't be pursued further. Within days, the scent faded again, disappearing as abruptly as it had arrived. The hallway returned to its usual stillness, the only sounds the distant echo of sneakers in the gym or the low hum of the building's heating system. But for those who had smelled it, the memory was difficult to shake. Warren Klein's disappearance remained officially unsolved. The attic stayed locked, its key held in the district's central office. Yet among certain staff, the story refused to settle. They claimed that on quiet nights, long after most had gone home, the faint sting of bleach would drift down from the upper floor again. It would last just long enough to make them stop and listen, their eyes on the sealed panel, before fading into the stillness, leaving them to wonder if the last shift in the quiet school had ever truly ended at all.